Hey, it's Alex Radcliffe from BoardGameCo, and today we are reviewing Rurik Dawn of Kiev, as well as the expansion Stone and Blade. And I'm going to start with the base game, and timestamps will be down below, so in case you want to skip to anything in particular, feel free. So I'm going to start with the base game, I'm going to go a quick overview, my pros and cons, and then from there I'm going to go into the expansion and my overview as well as pros and cons of that. And to be clear, this is not a rules explanation. I'm going to be covering a general feel for the game rather than specific rules and criteria of each individual thing, because there's a lot to cover here, so I want to go straight to it. So to begin with, Rurik Dawn of Kiev is a dudes on the map game with a programming mechanism going on in the game. Now, if you like Innis, if you like Lancaster, you're going to find elements of that game in here. And the game is divided up into 4 rounds, of which each round is divided up into a programming phase, and then finally an action selection phase. And those 4 rounds will not seem like a lot at first, but as you go through the game, you're going to find that it's really quite a lot that you can actually do in this game. So you're going to start with this programming board. You're going to have a programming board, and each player will have advisors that they get to put on this board. You get to choose one of these 6 actions: muster, move, tack, attacks, build, or scheme. Now, most of those are self-explanatory, but let's go through them as a quick overview. Muster will allow you to generate troops on the board. Move will allow you to move. Attack will allow you to attack. Tax will allow you to take off resources from the board. You're taxing regions and you're acquiring resources, which are important. Build lets you build buildings, which are, again, very important. And scheme lets you draw cards, both to get abilities as well as to kind of see what's coming in that scheme deck. Now, the thing about this game, the thing about that makes Rurik interesting, is you're going to have advisors with different numbers, different strengths. And the higher your number, the higher you can go on this board and knock other people down so that they take less efficient actions. So let's use muster as an example. With muster, the default action for muster is 3 musters. You generate 3 troops, then 2, then 1, and the final tier is you pay a coin to generate a single troop, which means the top action is more powerful. It's better inherently. The problem is, if you put your lower number advisor there, they're going to get knocked down by higher numbered advisors. The flip side is when it comes time to the second half of the phase, when it's the second half of each round in which you carry out the actions, you're going to carry them out in the order of the number placed, lower to higher. So in other words, your higher numbered advisors are better for ensuring that you get the action you want, but your lower numbered advisors will actually go first, taking those actions. So the game is a constant balance. In that programming phase, there's a constant balance of thinking through the order you want to carry your actions out, thinking through which actions you want and how you're going to lock those in, and then thinking through how the round will play out so you can actually take those actions. There is a lot of thinking, a lot of planning into that planning phase, into that programming phase of the game. Then when everyone's done placing their advisors, and you're going to have a varied number. Each player will have 4 in round 1, 2. You'll have a 5th advisor added in round 3, and a 6th advisor added in round 4. So you have a lot going on, even in the first rounds, but as you go through the later rounds, you'll have more going on. And there's other rules I'm not really getting into, such as the fact that you can bribe your advisor, so you can give up coins in order to get your advisor higher up, even though they are a lower number. There's a lot of thinking through both what you want, the sequencing, as well as how your opponents are going to mess you over, because they are going to mess you over. When you're done with that, you're going to go into the actual selection of the actual action. So congratulations, you locked in a attack action with your first advisor, so your first thing you have to do is carry out an attack. Where you carry out an attack, against whom the attack is carried out, those are still decisions that have to be made. To a certain degree, you have locked in the order of your turn. To a certain degree, you have locked in how your planning is going to play out. But there are still a lot of decisions to be made. Just because you know that you're going to attack, then move, then muster, then build, there are still a ton of ways that can actually be carried out. So there's still a ton of planning, there's still a ton of thinking, and you realize, well, I can attack first, but my opponent's going to be moving next. So if I attack him here first, that'll prevent him from moving next here. And versus if I try to attack her there, then she won't be able to build with her first action, which is also important. There are so many different ways that will play out. And then there are other mechanics at play, such as ruling regions are supremely impactful. In terms of when you rule a region, you have the majority of troops in that region compared to any other single player. And that will allow your building and your taxing to be more efficient, and will also come into play doing combat in terms of whether you incur a casualty or not, whether your opponent incurs a casualty or not. The reason you're doing all of this in the game is ultimately to, well, get points. This is a low scoring game. A scoring in the 25 to 30 point range is already a good score. I've seen people win with 23, 22 points. And And the reason you're trying to do all that is you're trying to dominate in one of 3 areas, which is where the bulk of your points are going to come in. You're going to get points through a variety of other things, but the bulk of your points are going to come in through these 3 areas, which are how efficiently you rule the board, how efficiently you have built across the board, and how efficiently you have collected goods in trade. That's primarily through the tax action. Now, more specifically, ruling it goes up the track one at a time, where if you rule 2 regions, you'll get 1 point, all the way up to if you rule 5 regions, including 2 specific regions on the board, you'll get 8 points at the end of the game. And you can see that getting to the top of the track in 2 of these areas is already going to be 16 points, combined with a few other ways that you can get points. Maybe you got a little bit lower on the other area, you got another 3 points there, you're already at 19. Combine one of your scoring cards from the beginning of the game, you get 2 more points from that, a few deeds that you've locked in, and suddenly you're at 24, 25 points and you've won the game. There is a lot going on in this game, and in terms of the ruling, how efficiently you build and how efficiently you tax goods to put them on your boat, because as you store up goods in your boat, you will both unlock a recurring revenue. You'll get revenue every single round, as well as it's a key game mechanism in terms of winning those points. That is a high-level overview of what's going on in Rurik. Ultimately, I think the core defining characteristic of Rurik is that programming phase. You have a programming selection going on in this game that you have to tensely think through how it plays out, how it'll affect your game, how it's going to carry through to the actual flow of taking those various actions as you play this game. So, with that said, let me start off with I'm going to start with my opinion, I'm going to go into the pros and cons and whatnot, and then I'm going to go deeper into my opinion at the end. So as a baseline, before I go into my pros and cons, understand that I love this game. I am a huge fan of Rurik. I have been a huge fan since the very first time I played it. This is a game that went from being not on my radar at all to top 10 material. I think in 2019, I believe I put it in my number 6 game of all time, and we will see where that ends up in 2020 because the expansion certainly will play a part. So let's go through my pros. So first of all, the action programming is a huge pro in this game. It is absolutely key. If you've ever played games like Robo Rally, Mechs and Minions, if you've ever enjoyed that aspect of trying to mentally plan through how a crazy sequence of events is going to play out, this takes it to the next level. It not only gives you more control, but the chaos is less introduced through an element of randomness and more introduced through trying to read your opponents. The action programming is full of hard choices that will be made left, right, and center. Do you want to go first in turn order so you can lock in a certain action and go first? Do you want to go later in turn order so you can react to how your opponents place their pieces, but them being able to go there first on the board means they can get the same thing for less? There's a lot of choices to be made in the action programming, and it is hugely amazing. It's like, one of the things I've always said is I love decisions in board games, and this gives you decisions to no end. It gives you meaningful choices that you realistically have to make again and again and again throughout those 4 rounds of play. The second aspect is that 2-phase gameplay. I love how the first phase is the action programming, but then it's not that you simply watch it resolve. Like if you play Mechs and Minions, when you get to that action, to the resolution, it's really just watching it resolve. But in this game, the decisions continue. Just because you have locked in a sequence of events, you still need to decide how it actually plays out in that second phase of gameplay, and I love that. It involves tight and brutal decisions across the board as to how you play out those actions that you kind of manage to lock in a bit through much tense decision making and a lot of things not working out your way. The next thing I like is I like the multiple paths to victory in this game. Because of the fact that the game gives you different elements, you can rule, build, trade, you can fight other units to additionally get more points that way. There are a lot of different ways you can try to specialize in this game to lock in that victory. To a certain extent, you're going to score points in all categories, and that's a big thing. And an important part I didn't mention that I think it's worth mentioning is however high you get on that track, you never go lower. So if you rule 5 regions and you get up to 5 points, even if later in the game you go lower, you stick with whatever the maximum you ever got to was. And once you lock something in, you're good to go. You can relax and focus on something else, which is huge. Because in this game, you're going to have to get points in all areas to ultimately win the game. You're going to want to score a few points here, a few points here, and then dominate in at least one area. So that aspect of the fact that the multiple paths to victory will hugely impact the way you play the game is absolutely key. I love the ability to do a surprising amount in a surprisingly low amount of time. Whenever I start off with a game, whenever I look at rules for a game and I see, well, I have 5 rounds to do everything I need, I'm never going to be able to do that. The games always vary in how much they deliver and that promise. I like doing things in games. I play games to feel like I can do a lot, not to feel restricted. And 4 rounds might seem like a little, but in reality, the amount you do in this game is an absolute ton. In those 4 rounds, in that, the programming and then the follow through, there is so much you get done in this game that I've never really walked away at the end thinking, well, I wish the game was longer. Not in the slightest. A 5th round would drag this out too long. The game is perfect in its current form, which brings us to my next pro, which is this regularly comes in at 90 minutes. This game delivers a ton of action, a ton of experience in generally 90 minutes consistently across the board. Once you know the game, it might take a little longer the first times, as you especially, there's going to be a lot of AP going on the first few times you play the game, because you have to figure out not just what you want to do, but how your opponents are going to mess with you. But as you know the game, as you play it with players who are experienced in the game, there's going to be a lot you can do in this game. The next thing I like is there are catch-up mechanics in this game. I'm generally a fan of catch-up mechanics. I'm generally a fan of when a player is not doing as well, there is some form of something that gives them a little bit more of an edge. And to be clear, there's not a ton in this game, which is good. I don't like it when a catch-up mechanic makes it so that losing doesn't really matter. It should matter, but it does give you a little bit of element. If you're not advancing on those trees, if you're not getting points, you will get extra money and be able to utilize that each round. I also like the event deck, something I didn't really talk about, which are these cards over here that as you take them, you're going to be able to, you don't have to do it. It's a modular expansion sort of in the base game, but you can use these to change the way the game will play out. It'll give it a little bit of variety that maybe this round, maybe in round 2, you can't actually tax without paying an extra coin. Maybe in round 3, there's a bit of a feast and something else is happening and everyone will get extra resources. There's a little bit of a slight variety to the gameplay just to mix it up in case things are getting a little stale. And then lastly, I'll mention as a pro that there is a solo mode. I haven't played it, to be clear. I'm not familiar with the solo mode. I haven't utilized it at all. But if you are looking for a solo mode, this game does have a solo mode. From there, let's go to the cons, the things I didn't like. And in general, in these reviews, I divide up into 2 categories. The things I personally did not like, and the things I can see being a problem for other people, and why they weren't a problem for me. So to begin with the cons, the lack of variability. This event deck aside, and I don't believe they're called in mech cards, and maybe called in tree cards or something, but this event deck aside, ultimately, while I love this game, while it was top 6 for me, and while it was number 6 game in 2019 for me, the more I played it, the more it shifted downwards. Still in my top 20, to be clear, not a bad game in the slightest, but it did shift down over time because I've played this game a lot. I've played this at least over 10 times, and every time I played it, as much as I think it's incredible every time I play it, it isn't different every time I play it. The feeling of the game, even with these intrigue cards, the feeling of the game still ends up being the same for me every single time. It still ends up feeling the exact same way. It's still a good game, still a great game. But contrast that with Innocent Blood Rage, some of my favorite 2s and maps games ever. Every time I play those, somehow it manages to feel like, wow, this game was totally different. The way things played out was so different, even though I play those games a lot as well. Rurik is a game that I thoroughly enjoy, but it did start to feel a bit samey the more I played it. And again, still a great game, but did feel samey. Secondly, is that I mentioned that the game comes in at 90 minutes, but we have had games of Rurik that dragged out, and I don't know how or when to define that, but sometimes a game of Rurik has lasted us 3 hours, which is, to be clear, it's the exception, but it has happened that for some reason or another, it just drags out, not because of new players, that I would understand, but rather even with the core people in my group who have played this game, sometimes it just drags out, sometimes it just takes longer than it should, and I don't have an easy explanation as to why, but that certainly can be a con, especially if you're relying on a stable game length. Also, I'll note, keep in mind, this is my personal experience. It could very well be that someone else will say, no, I played Rurik in 90 minutes every single time, clear and concise. I don't know. For us, we've had in a few games where it dragged out a little longer, and that can make that 90-minute playtime a little harder to rely on, especially if you're trying to fit it into a gap where you only have 90 minutes to 2 hours. And lastly, the leaders, I just wish the leaders were cooler. All of the leaders in this game, and I didn't really talk about it, but at the beginning of the game, you're going to get 2 leaders to choose from, and you'll choose one of the leaders, and you'll use that ability, which will give you some sort of extra ability. Maybe you can generate troops, maybe you can muster troops in adjacent regions, maybe your leader will stop other players' buildings from working. So there are different abilities that all sound phenomenally cool, but in practice, at least in our games, it's been okay. We usually use the abilities a little bit here and there, but they're not so impactful. I kind of wish there was more, either a faction ability or leader abilities, which just more. I wish. I don't really know. Just the asymmetry of the game doesn't really feel as strong as it reads on paper. On paper, it comes across as, wow, I can't believe I'll be able to utilize this ability to so many different ways. And in practice, we end up using those abilities once or twice a game, and they're just not that meaningful. Doesn't stop it from being a good game, but it certainly is something I would have liked to see a little bit more of a oomph to. I've talked about this a lot. I like player powers. It's my thing. I like powers and abilities in games. And that's basically it for my cons. Which brings us to, what can I see other players not liking? What can I see other people being bothered by, and why do they not bother me? So the first and foremost, and this is a big one, remember this programming board that I love so much? It's chaos. I can see people being incredibly frustrated by the fact that they didn't get to do what they wanted to do. You're going to be placing your advisors on these boards and getting them knocked down. You're going to consistently know ahead of time that you will not be able to get everything you want, but at the end of the day, you'll hopefully lock in enough actions as other players knock your advisors lower down the track. And it can be frustrating for people. It can be very frustrating to feel in this game that ultimately this is a game where you can often choose what to do, you can often choose when to do it, but you can rarely choose both. You can rarely decide that I want to get this level of action and I want to do it earlier in the turn. You're going to be making hard choices that involve a lot of time not getting what you want. Now for me, I love that tension. That's meaningful to me. I want to see how it plays out, and I recognize I won't get everything, but neither will the other players either, and it all balances out. But it can be frustrating. It can be frustrating to try to have a plan and watch it constantly fail every single turn as you place your guys. So I can see that being frustrating for some people. I'll also note that the combat has a luck-based mechanism, which I can see other people not liking, where ultimately when you attack other players in combat, you're going to draw these cards, and if there is a player symbol on the bottom of the card, which nope, still no player symbol, and there we go. If there's a little symbol on the bottom of the card, then you will lose one of your troops. And the ratio, I think, is somewhere in the range of 30-something%, 37% of the cards have a symbol, but it can effectively result in you having a bunch of attacks where you end up losing people, and other players having attacks where they don't. And the amount of attacking in this game is small enough that it may end up impacting one player more negatively without averaging out over the course of the game. Now, the reason it doesn't bother me is very particular, because usually that's a mechanic that would bother me. Usually that aspect of having luck that doesn't have time to average out, usually that would bother me a lot. The reason it doesn't in this game is for our games, for specifically my group, what that has led to is a very low combat heavy game. In general in this game, most of the troop conquest comes through generating more troops, movement, manipulation, the actual amount of physical attacks against other players, and I'll note there are rebels you can attack, which are different, they don't have that same casualty aspect, but when you attack other players in this game, very often we'll go through an entire game and have 2 or 3 attacks the entire game, meaning because of the fact that we don't want to let luck play a part in having too advantageous a swing, we tend to just rely on other tactics to play the game. So for me, it actually turns it into a bit of a con, where this is a game where the threat of bad things happening is constantly present for us, but the actual combat isn't that bad because we just don't engage with it that much. So again, I can very much see it being a con, very much see it being a problem for other people. For us, it changed the nature of what the game is, but it changed it in a way that we really liked. Which the next thing is, this kind of leads to the next potential con, which is the lack of combat. If you're expecting a very combat heavy game, it could be that other people have a different experience. It could be that you'll have more combat going on in this game, and depending on who you play with or how you play. But in our groups, we just didn't have that much combat. And for us, we are fine with that. We like the manipulation, the tactics, and the politics aspect of the game far more than the actual warfare, but every player is different, and it might be a problem. If you're looking to have a whole bunch of wild, heavy conflict fights or whatnot, pick up Kemet, pick up Blood Rage. Those are going to be better games if you're looking for a very combat-heavy game, although, note that we'll talk about that more when it comes to the expansion. And lastly, the last potential con I'll mention is something that I definitely warn new players of when we introduce it to them. This is a game where it is easy to lose focus on all the stuff you're doing. It's easy to lose focus on how to score points because of all the things you are doing instead. What I mean by that is there's so many things in this game that are happening that you can be so focused on trying to lock in your actions and lock in what you want to do that you lose sight of what you actually need to do to score points. You can walk through the whole game feeling like you were being competitive, and then when you actually score up the points, you're like, well, I didn't really do much. It can be easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees or whatnot, that you're focused on what you're trying to do and not on what you should do, and that's very easy to happen. It's something I try to warn new players and guide them through, but it's something that can be a problem, and it can certainly negatively affect your own experience. And that's what I have for that, which brings us to Rurik, Stone, and Blade. And I'll save my final thoughts of both of these when I'm finally done with everything. But Rurik, Stone, and Blade is the newest expansion that is, well, on Kickstarter right now, because you may be seeing this video from the Kickstarter, you may be seeing it from my channel, wherever you're seeing it from. There is a current Kickstarter for Stone and Blade right now, and Stone and Blade adds a few things to this game. So it basically adds 4 things. It adds core general changes to the game, plus 3 modules. And I'll cover those as quickly as possible in brief. The core changes to the game is it adds new buildings, it adds new setup to the game, and it adds some new leaders, and that's basically it. A few more cards and whatnot. So it adds a few basic changes to the game that just in general change the game. And they may not sound that meaningful, but what the buildings do are so key. If you know Rurik, because I didn't really go into what all the buildings do, but some some of the new buildings, for instance, the stables. When you put down a stable, when you build a stable, you instantly get 3 movement points to spread out. When you build a tavern, you instantly get coins equal to the number of buildings in that spot, but you also get to play the top card of the scheme discard pile, whatever that might be. Your opponent may have just used an amazing card against you. You can turn around and use it back against them. If you know Rurik, those 2 buildings alone are worth the expansion. Now, obviously not worth the expansion, the price and whatnot, but for me, they are drastic game changers to what this game does, to how it does it, to how I experience this game. Those 2 buildings give you so many more options, so many more selections, and I think from a design aspect, the way they talked about it is each of the current buildings currently focuses on one of these different actions and the way they augment the actions. If you build a marketplace from the base game, then when you can get a second good. If you build the fortress, the stronghold, it affects combat and how that plays out. So they added these new buildings that affect the other actions in ways that weren't previously being affected, so that most of the actions feel a bit more fleshed out in the game. And those buildings are essential. It adds a new varied startup in terms of you'll be drawing these different cards over here. You'll be drawing these starting cards that instead of getting more money and more troops, you'll get a little bit less money, a little bit less troops at the start of the game, but you'll instead get these cards that you can grab to possibly start with a building in a zone. Maybe you start with a troop in a zone. You'll start with different things on the board that can change the game state. So there's default changes to the game that are already pretty fantastic. But additionally, it gives you 3 modules. The first module is it gives you a bunch of great buildings or whatnot. These are common buildings that any player can build that will affect the game state in different ways. Perhaps you built the catacombs and now no one else, I don't remember which one the catacombs is. No one else can build more buildings. I believe the catacombs is nobody else can build more buildings in that zone, which can be game changing. Perhaps you build the Great Bazaar, the Great Marketplace, or whatever this one is called. I might be getting the names wrong. And now whenever you tax, you can exchange a good. There are different common buildings that other players will be able to play that you'll all have access to. At the beginning of the game, you'll randomly pick the number of players plus 1. So in a 3-player game, you would pick 4 of these buildings, you'd place them out, and all players have access to building or taking advantage of those buildings as the game progresses. And that adds hugely to the variability. The fact that you're going to have this module that's every game, the available buildings will be different, it adds a lot to the variability of the game, which is my biggest complaint against it from a personal stance. The second module adds an element of combat. It doubles down. Oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. The last change of the game that the base expansion does to the gameplay is it makes both combat as well as gathering goods in your boat slightly more rewarding. It gives on your boat you'll get these extra wild tokens as you fill up slots, which can make you taxing more rewarding, and it makes combat more rewarding by giving you additional incentives as you move up the combat track. And so the second module, which is what reminded me of this, the second module is a combat-focused module in which it gives you more ways to fight, more cards for fighting. It gives you an extra ability token that you'll be able to flip to fight, and it adds this element of capturing to the game. So it really focuses more on a combat-heavy game. It gives you a lot more room for combat. If previously you thought it was a con, that there's not enough combat in this game, playing with that module will up the amount of combat in Rurik. And the last expansion is a rebel faction expansion, where it's going to give these rebels a bit more life of their own. It's going to give them ways that they generate more troops and ways you can eventually quell the rebel uprising, potentially getting more points along the way. And those are the various things that the expansion adds. So, what do I think of the expansion? Well, ultimately, I think it's incredible. I think the expansion adds what I needed Rurik to be, because of the amount of variability it adds to the game. Not just in the modular expansions, which gives you different ways to play. You can sit there and say, you know what, today we're going to play with the Rebel expansion faction, and we're not going to play with the rest, because we just want to add that little tweak to the game to have a different gameplay experience and shift up how we enjoy, how we experience Rurik. That is excellent. But additionally, the building expansion alone, the building module alone, adds so much variability. And then those core buildings, that stable and the tavern, adds so much to the game. Rurik Stone and Blade has taken Rurik, a game that was slowly moving down the track for me, and pushed it straight back into top 10. I don't know exactly where, we'll find out at the end of 2020, but it has pushed it straight back to where it was, letting it hold its place in my collection. In terms of pros and cons, pros are awesome new buildings, there are new leaders, the variable starting setup makes the starting point of the game change off the bat. The building module makes every single game differently, and the expansion gives you a drop more room to get a little bit more done, because it gives you some extra stuff without taking away that much. Even if you thought there wasn't enough to get done in the base game, there's a little bit more to get done with the expansion added. Not that I had a complaint before. As far as cons, I will note it's a modular expansion, and in general, modular expansions do have the con that unless you're just playing with everything all the time, you will have to incur additional setup setup or teardown as you try to bundle the various cards and components with the different expansions into the different areas that they go. So there is a little bit more setup and teardown of mental energy to the gameplay being added. But past that, I can't really say there were any other cons to the expansion. The expansion to me it took Rurik, which I guess now will be the final thoughts point. Rurik is a game that I absolutely love. I love the programming mechanisms in this game. I love the fact that you have to consistently think through what you want to do, how you want to do it, how you're going to accomplish your objectives. It is a game that plays in usually 90 minutes and gives you a tense, exciting experience every time, where you frequently feel as annoyed and frustrated by your by your friends, as you are frustrating them and stymieing their plans. It is consistently giving and taking in equal doses in an action-packed strategic experience. My biggest personal complaint against Rurik came down to the variability of the game, and the expansion to me not only fixes the variability, but gives you new buildings, new things to do that are so rewarding. I mean it when I say that the stables and taverns alone are such huge additions to the game that genuinely flesh out and round out the experience in ways that make me incredibly excited to own this expansion. That's basically it. That is my opinion of Rurik Stone and Blade. Rurik and Rurik Stone and Blade. I love this game. I highly recommend it. If you have played Rurik, the expansion is a no-brainer to add to your collection. If you haven't played Rurik, then it does depend on what kind of games you like. But like I said, if you like Lancaster, if you like Innis, Blood Rage maybe as well, but not as much. But if Lancaster and Innis already, I think, are great choices. If you like either of those games, Rurik is a great addition to your collection. There's a lot of strategic planning in this game that you will find it incredibly rewarding if you can get past the frustration of not being able to always get what you want. It's about knowing you're going to win some battles and lose others, and those battles won't be as combat focused so much as they will be about the politics and maneuvering of how to get what you want out of this game. I am Alex Radcliffe from BoardGameCo. I hope you enjoyed this fairly long review of everything going on. This is a base game and expansion here, so lots to cover. As usual, timestamps will have been below, so you'll already have seen that. Once again, I am Alex. If you've enjoyed this video, if you like it, go ahead and subscribe down below. And otherwise, until next time, have a good one.